reduction again, that's perfect. These are all carbon-oxygen bonds, and when the 6 carbons and the 6 carbon dioxides become a glucose, some of those bonds are now carbon-carbon and some of them are even carbon-hydrogen, so we're definitely moving uphill on this energy scale, so that's a reduction. See, these carbons being reduced, and therefore it's going to be non-spontaneous. And this is also part of the photosynthesis process. Plants make glucose when they do photosynthesis from carbon dioxides that are just floating around in the air. So there's that potential energy down here. Now, one of the features of non-spontaneous reactions is, since the molecule going through a non-spontaneous reaction is gaining potential energy, you have to always put energy into a non-spontaneous reaction to make it occur. This is just never going to go just automatically on its own. Things don't go uphill on their own. And that's where the sunlight and photosynthesis comes in, right? The reduction. There we go. That's where the sunlight comes in photosynthesis. The plants are using solar energy as the energy source to push these carbons uphill, so to speak, to reduce those carbons into glucose. And let's see, that brings us to this next concept, if I can find the overhead. So the whole point of all this was how do cells store up potential energy, and what you see here is essentially one way of doing that. Cells can store up potential energy by making organic molecules with many reduced carbons. Or maybe a better way of phrasing that would have been, the cells can create molecules with more reduced carbons than the starting molecules, because then you are storing up potential energy in those covalent bonds, in those carbon-hydrogen and carbon-carbon bonds that used to be just plain old low-energy carbon-oxygen bonds. So that's really why the plant is doing photosynthesis. It wants to store up some of that energy from the sunlight in the covalent bonds of glucose, so that if it needs energy later on, like at nighttime when the sun's not shining, it has that energy stored up and available to meet its needs. I guess you don't normally think of sugar as being stored up sunlight energy, but in a sense that's what it is. Good. So any metabolic reaction where the carbons are being reduced, it's a non-spontaneous reaction, and so you're going to have an energy input to do that. Now, eventually, the plant wants to use the energy that it's stored up in the glucose molecule, and then we have to think about this kind of reaction where the plant is going to take that glucose and oxidize those carbons all the way back down into carbon dioxides. So that's now going to be a spontaneous reaction, and as those carbons lose potential energy, as they go downhill, the plant is able to tap into that energy typically to recharge its ATP supply. The energy to make the ATPs comes from this process being carried out from the carbons losing potential energy. Well, the one I showed you before was photosynthesis. That opposite process that you're seeing here has a name. It's called cellular respiration. And that's another process that we're going to learn about as soon as we finish learning about photosynthesis. Sound all right? All right, let's go on then. Actually, let me go back to that slide here. There we go. Okay. So, just to kind of recap something, there's more potential energy here in the glucose than here in the 6 carbon dioxides that the glucose can turn into. So moving from here to here is a spontaneous downhill reaction, potential energy-wise, which, as I've been emphasizing a lot, you can think of as like water running downhill that's loss of potential energy for the water. That's also a spontaneous energy-producing reaction. Okay, so if you think about it that way, water automatically runs downhill. If you put water at the top of a hill, whoosh, it just automatically will flow downhill because that's the spontaneous reaction. Things in our universe want to do the spontaneous reactions. They want to lose potential energy. And so my thought question is, well, why doesn't glucose do that automatically? A lot of the things that we deal with every day are made out of glucose, or at least polymerized glucose, like breads and cereals and pasta. And so when you get a potato or a bowl of pasta or your breakfast cereal, why doesn't it just explode? Because there's lots of oxygens in the air, and so you might think at first, well, if it's a downhill reaction, why doesn't the glucose in those things just go poof and turn into carbon dioxide? And it would be a pretty big explosion. There is a lot of energy stored up in glucose. At this other college I used to teach at, the chemistry instructor used to do a demonstration for his students. He would get some gummy bears, which are high in glucose, and pour in an oxidizer powder, which is just a powder that provides oxygen very efficiently. And I guess light it on fire, the thing would go whammo and make a large explosion. And one time it was such a big smoky reaction that the smoke alarms went off inside the whole building, and they had to evacuate. It was kind of funny. Well, I thought it was kind of funny. But he got banned from doing that demonstration again. Anyway, so the question is, well, why doesn't your cereal and your potatoes and things explode if it's a spontaneous downhill reaction? Well, here's the answer. Yes, it is a spontaneous downhill reaction, and the glucoses do want to turn into carbon dioxide, just like water wants to go downhill. But if you look at the potential energy diagram, it's actually like this. It is a downhill reaction, but there's a potential energy bump that prevents those glucoses from flowing downhill, so to speak, and turning into carbon dioxide. And that bump has a name. It's called the activation energy. It's the energy that you have to add to a spontaneous reaction to make it go. And so don't get confused. When we say a spontaneous reaction, we just mean that the products have lower potential energy than the starting materials, than the reactants, and that's certainly the case here. But what I am saying is, to get from here to there, you have to initially put in a little bit of energy to get over the activation energy barrier before you can go downhill and get the products. What causes that? What is the basis for the activation energy? It's simply this, that before you can replace these like carbon-hydrogen bonds with a carbon-oxygen, you have to break off that hydrogen. And to break a covalent bond requires some energy input. And so you have to put a little bit of energy in to get over the hump to break the bonds before you can recombine them with oxygens to get the product molecules. And where might that energy come from? Well, one thing might be the glucose molecules colliding with each other. Remember, at temperature means molecules speed and they bump into each other. But at room temperature, there's not enough energy of the glucoses colliding with each other to put them over the activation energy barrier, and so that's why this doesn't happen at room temperature. If you were to heat up that glucose, like in a flame or something, then there would be enough kinetic energy for them to crash together so quickly that you get over the activation energy barrier, and you would be able to burn up the glucose then into carbon dioxide. This activation energy barrier isn't just for glucose becoming carbon dioxide. Pretty much every reaction chemical reaction has at least some activation energy that it has to get over to occur. And particularly the ones that involve organic molecules, like our metabolic reactions, all have activation energy barriers. So that means that the reactions that take place inside your cells that keep you alive and functioning, keep the cell alive and functioning, have to get over that activation energy barrier. And the cells cannot have little flames inside to heat up the molecules to get them over that activation energy barrier. You're at body temperature, which is usually not enough to get over the activation energy barrier. And so that's where enzymes come in. When I introduced enzymes to you earlier, I said they are polymers and amino acids, which are the little green dots there. And remember, each enzyme has an active site where it binds the substrate molecules, the molecules it works with, and they click into the active site, and then it turns them into the product molecules and releases them. What I didn't really mention at that time is that enzymes lower activation energy barriers. As the substrate molecules are brought into the active site and aligned with each other perfectly for the reaction to occur, that helps lower their activation energy barriers, bringing them together and pushing them together in the right orientation lowers the EA. So enzymes make reactions occur really by lowering the activation energy barrier. The general term for that is any substance that speeds up a reaction by lowering the activation energy is termed a catalyst. And so we sometimes say enzymes are the biological catalysts of living things. And really they catalyze pretty much every reaction that goes on inside living things. They're all carried out by enzymes. If someone were to make all the enzymes suddenly vanish from inside your cells, even the spontaneous reactions like this one would not work, because even at body temperature, that's too high a potential energy barrier. So enzymes do this. They shave off the potential energy barrier, so to speak. And one last question here. That spontaneous or non-spontaneous reaction? Non-spontaneous. So if I add an enzyme, does it become a spontaneous reaction? No. Enzymes lower the activation energy, but that doesn't make a non-spontaneous reaction spontaneous. You're still going to need an energy input to make this occur. The enzyme just lowered the activation energy a bit. Okay, that sounds good. We'll see you guys in an hour for the midterm.